You're listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 FM. Coming to you now, it's Gary Krug and Long Waves. And I need to tell you right at the beginning of the show, as I always do, that the opinions expressed here are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. And thank you for joining me today. Beautiful day. Love summer. Especially love summer in Spokane. Well, today's show is continuing week 4 of my Propaganda July, and this week we're going to talk about the 7 deadly sins are our national way of life. And this will all become apparent at a moment. I've been following the news lately, as I'm wont to do, as I expect you have too. And if you look at the political news, it's all about Trump. Trump, and Bernie, and Hillary. And it's the same old nonsense. So, they're calling, Trump the clown candidate. They're calling Bernie a national socialist. You got to love that, calling Bernie a Nazi. Where's AIPAC when you need them, And, it's the usual nonsense. Boxers are brief. I'm not going to talk about any of this. Boxers or briefs. Who cares? Truth is, this is all a distraction. This is the same distraction that Ben Bagdikian, some years ago, the great analyst of communications, said, referred to as the dig here, not there kind of news. So in other words, go for the easy stories, the clickbait stories, the stories that are not, they may upset people in the world, get them fired up about something, get them, oh, look how dumb this person is, but there's nothing in them that disturbs power. Nothing in the news ever really disturbs power. In fact, the contemporary news in the U.S., all of the mainstream news, just go out of their way to not upset power, to explain things away, how the U.S. can be, ISIS can one day be our mortal enemy and an existential threat to the U.S., and within a day or two, they can become our new allies in the Middle East. And ISIS is an existential threat to the United States, but in a few days, they become our new allies in the Middle East. And we went into Afghanistan to get rid of al-Qaeda. We got rid of al-Qaeda, and then we changed the game. We were going to get rid of the Taliban. The Taliban are still there, and we're supposed to be gone, but it looks like we're going to stay there for a long time in the Middle East, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on. And whatever madness comes out of our leaders, whatever madness comes out of those loony bins, like the Brookings Institute and the American Enterprise Institute, and all the places where out-of-work politicians go to get paid by corporations, all of it is completely normal. Nothing challenges the established order. There are the limits and the parameters of the political discourse, which are set by power, are inviolable. And, there are a couple of rules that everybody has to follow. Power and government are good. Power and government are good. Whatever they're doing, it is good. Crazy wars that make no sense, it's good. Wars that go on forever, it's good. And it's all good for some kind of abstract reason like freedom or stopping terror or the war against terror or whatever. It's nonsense. So power and government are good, right? And whomever is our current enemy is bad. People who call attention to what governments are really doing are bad. People who try to say something or to build a movement that is contrary to the official dogma of Washington are bad. And nothing disturbs this. Right? CBS, NBC, Fox, they just roll along. NPR. NPR has taken a decided turn to the right in the last few years, but it has a great deal to do with some of the funding, I think, that they have been receiving. But anyway, but why can we complain? How can we complain? Our freedom's intact. Our freedom is intact. We are free to say whatever we want, write whatever we say to want, but you've got to keep it off the front pages. Right? Chomsky's not on the front pages. Chris Hedges isn't on the front pages. Pierre Giraud is not on the front pages of the news. Right? So it'll be, in some little off-the-wall, not terribly important little website somewhere, Truthdig or Truthout or Alternet or some such place, Crooks and Liars. But it'll never be mainstream because they don't want it on mainstream. And the people who run and own the mainstream media are not going to let it on there. Say what you want, but stay off the front pages. Say what you want, but it'll never be on TV. Not in this country. All right, maybe some obscure cable station, but it won't be on the national networks. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if we actually had intelligent discussions, debates, real debates, not these dog and pony shows that we use for the presidential elections, these little set pieces, but real debates or real discussions by interesting people who have ideas and who aren't just going to stand there and mouth these truisms and these falsehoods. And then in those occasions when something popular does seem to rise up from the ground, something like, Occupy Wall Street, that's a good one, or any kind of genuine resistance or genuine political opposition, somebody who starts making waves on a socialist ticket, as happened in Seattle, anything too popular is smashed or not covered. Occupy got a little big. They got too much news. They weren't going away, and they were smashed. And this is how it works. And the funny thing is, we keep pretending that we have politics. We keep pretending that we have some kind of genuine freedom. The freedom to say nothing is not really freedom. The freedom to say something would be freedom, but this is different. But we fall for it every time. And the question is, why do we keep falling for it? Why do we keep falling for these tribal threats to our way of life? Ooh, bad people overseas. Ooh, well, we have to have a war. We have to kill them. We have to destroy them. Challenge. These are tribal things. Why do we keep falling for it? Right? None of the wars that we're currently in, and I can't even count them on all my fingers and toes, but none of the wars that we're currently in are actually wars we need to be in. None of them. But we keep falling for it. Here's a threat to us. Ooh, aren't you scared? Look at these spooky, scary people on TV. Be afraid. We're going to have a war. Support it. And then we have the whole propaganda mechanism that grinds along and conflates whatever is going to allay our fears with militarism and nationalism. We keep falling for it. We keep falling for these violations of the bonds that should be holding our society and culture together, the truths and realities that everybody who's not completely anesthetized or numbed is aware of. That these lies break faith with us. They betray us. They betray our trust. And they ridicule our ability to see through it. And finally, these great lies and great stories, these distractions, are finally just that. They're distractions. They distract us because we're isolated. They distract us as a kind of compensation. They distract us to keep us amused and feel that it's politics. But politics, above all, must be amusing. Above all. Because, this is the entertainment world. This is what we've created for ourselves. Or rather, this is what the major communications companies have created for us. And in the meantime, they divide us. They not only set us against the world, that everyone's a spooky alien. I mean, look how absolutely stupid people get about Islam. Oh, it's so bad, it's so bad. This is exactly what Protestants and Catholics used to do to each other. This is what Calvinists and Lutherans used to do to each other. It's the same kind of partisan nonsense that will continue as long as we keep falling for the trick. As long as we keep pretending that these divisions are not by and large of our own making. Yes, ISIS is a bunch of bad guys. Al-Qaeda is a bunch of bad guys. Well, Al-Qaeda was created largely or funded largely by rich Saudis, and certainly encouraged by us. The Taliban and Afghanistan, you remember Reagan saying they were the moral equivalent of the founding fathers of America? He said that. And then it just slips out of our mind. Meanwhile, we're set against each other at home, black and white, rich and poor, immigrants and natives. This nativist card, we haven't seen a nativist card like this since the riots in New York in the 19th century when, the Irish were coming over. And the Irish who'd gotten here before were talking about the ones coming over as trash, and we're the real Americans. It's such an easy card to play. Propaganda can always play on self and identity and freedom and other things as well. Which we'll talk about. So, how do they do it? Well, as I have been saying for 3 weeks, they play on basic needs, desires, and drives. They manipulate them. They stimulate them. They create fetish objects. They scare us. It's very simple kinds of things. We get fear, and we want the fear to go away. And these are very basic kind of human needs. These are needs that children have, right? Children are afraid. They need to be comforted. Children need to be touched. Children need to be affirmed. Children need to be taught that their world will be consistent. Children need to learn that there are contracts, so to speak, between them and their parents. And as I have mentioned on this show more than once, as these understandings, these taken for granted truths of how the world works that we learn as children, as we develop into maturity, we expect a lot of the same kinds of things to work. We expect people to be basically kind. We expect people to reciprocate. We expect people to follow the same rules that we follow. And if we learn that our needs won't be met, if we experience food insecurity, if we experience violence, if we of any kind, social, sexual, witnessing violence, if we have unstable households, we learn this too. And this becomes part of our understanding of what it is to be social creatures in the world. We grow up broken in these situations. You know, the rules governing human behavior, just basic human behavior, what we as a species do, how we as a species would normally treat each other. These things woven across millennia are unlearned. And in their place are anger, rage, helplessness, an inability to bond authentically, emotionally with others, all kinds of obsessions and addictions and violence. And instead of helping us, instead of helping to recreate these bonds that would teach us all, help us understand, reinforce these century-old, millennial-old human ideas of how we are in the world, media play on it. They manipulate it. They use it to their own advantage. Advertisers do, propagandists do. You know, and it's getting so you can't even distinguish the propagandists from the people in government. I mean, Robert Kagan, a neocon from way back and the husband of Victoria Nuland. You know, Kagan started off as a propagandist in Reagan's administration. And now he's out there still working his shtick and still playing on anger and helplessness and misunderstanding of others and violence. I talked a week or so ago about the ACEs study and about David Lisak's work looking at what happens to children who don't grow up well, who have violence in their youth, especially sexual violence. And who would prey on that? Who? Who would use that as a way to manipulate people? Powers and the people who control them without regard for the well-being of others. Sociopaths. Corporations are sociopathic. By nature, they do not care. And that's why sociopaths are so good at rising to power in corporations. And I mean something very precise with sociopath. I mean people with an inability to feel. People who are very clever at manipulating others because they understand exactly what their weak spots are and how to play to them, how to suck up to them, how to fluff them up, and just use them until they're done. And especially play on their weaknesses. So we run into this all the time. Instead of growing up learning to trust, instead of growing up learning to care, where our first instinct is not suspicion, but caring. Instead of learning that, we have essentially, as a culture, turned the 7 deadly sins into our cultural values. You know, and I could walk through those real quickly for you here. I'll talk about them more later in the show. There is sloth, also known as acedia, which is this despair or where you just give up. You can't do anymore. And you really don't care. You can't even fulfill your duties as a person, as a husband or a wife or a citizen, because you just don't care. That has probably a great deal to do with why we have such low voting rates, with why we have such little real involvement in the world, and why we see the diminution of social organizations, groups. The numbers are shrinking, and their membership are graying, and young people aren't coming in. Because this acedia, this sloth, has become one of our virtues. And then there is the virtue of avaricia, greed. Not just greed, but greed beyond any possible need, greed beyond any possible reason, the gathering together of stupid amounts of wealth, for example, or stupid amounts of power, not to do good, but simply to do it. And holding this up as a cultural virtue. Get more stuff. Make more money. Then you'll be a better person. Luxuria, lust, invidia, envy. And in all old cultures, and all cultures before industrial capital and before the mass media, envy was a very big thing. Envy is the original evil eye, to gaze upon someone's things enviously, to look at things in an unethical way, to covet what people have, to be jealous of it. And people were always very careful to not catch the evil eye, to not see the envy in the others. And then there's wrath. We're so good at wrath as a people, aren't we? We are just so good at it. Somebody hurts us, what's our first response? Revenge, wrath, anger. Somebody does something to America, wrath and anger. Somebody burns a flag, wrath and anger, which tells us that wrath, rage lies just under the surface all the time. And gluttony in a country that is 50% obese, gluttony, yeah, let's throw in gluttony. But I've saved the best one for last. I've said superbia. Pride. Pride, overweening pride, the pride that goes before a fall, the pride that manifests itself in things like American exceptionalism. We are the one exceptional nation. What arrogant pride is this? I am the one exceptional person. You put it on that level, it sounds stupid. You put it on a national level, and people want to participate in it. Yeah, we are strong. But it's pride. Why are these sins? Why were these sins? Why were they deadly sins in particular? Why? Because they destroy charity. They destroy caritas, philos. They destroy the thing that bonds people together as people. This makes these deadly. They destroy the social fabric. And we have raised them to our national virtues. We should start carving them in stone, you know? Instead of the 10 Commandments, we ought to put up the 7 deadly sins. It would be closer to the truth. They not only destroy, though, caritas, caring, charity, they also destroy any possibility for the unexpected, the unearned, the unasked for. In short, for what the theologians would call grace, and the engineers of our world would call noise, because it's not predictable, it's not systematic, it interferes with things. So, having raised the 7 deadly sins to the level of national catchphrases, self-descriptive ones at that, what does this do to the social framework? And what does it do to us? And what are our possibilities for something different? What replaces our social obligations and reciprocal duties to one another. What's taught, what's extolled, what's cherished. We hear all of this blather about values. Got your family values, you got your Christian values, you got your traditional values, but values are, as concepts, are empty, vacuous, and dead. The only value we really have outside of the 7 I just gave is just believe what we're saying. It's true. Because we say it. And this creates some real problems for us. Because the whole of the political language, the whole of the social language, all of those signs and symbols that we use every day, apparently, supposedly, to make sense of the world with other people, they're poisoned. They're so misused, they are consistently poisoned. And we've reached the point where, in truth, there is so much distrust, not just of foreigners, not just of brown people, if you're white, but distrust of people and distrust of government, distrust of religious organizations, which are taking a huge hit. Memberships are falling. None of the above is the fastest growing religion in America. We see open, vociferous opposition, at least verbally, to government. We see it on the right and the left. But nothing in the way of solutions, just people picking up the catchphrases and hurling them at each other. Liberal, redneck, black, white, immigrant, just hurling these things at each other, right and left. It's no wonder I keep finding myself thinking of William Butler Yeats' poem, The Second Coming. And, we've got so many folks anyway waiting for the second coming to come, the blood moons and all of this. But I would point out that most of them seem to have missed the point of the first coming. So I don't know what they expect from the second one. But back to Yeats. We have reached the point. I will read a few lines. I'll read the whole damn poem. What the heck? Turning and turning and widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the senescence, the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming's at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, his hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. William Butler Yeats. And that's the position we're in. The world is spinning out, and it's undeniable to even the most isolated, confirmed denier of everything It is apparent. It's in front of us. And not in the abstract, but in some very real ways. We're in the sixth great die-off that we know of on the planet. We're losing stupid numbers of species. We are in the grips of global climate change, and we are standing at a precipice. At a precipice where we start to get what are called self-reinforcing feedback loops, which will accelerate this global warming. They'll accelerate the effects of it, if they occur, and make it much, much worse than it is. There was a piece recently in The Guardian which quoted one scientist as saying, and I read it on the story on the show some while ago. It quoted one scientist as saying, "It is entirely likely that entirely possible, not entirely likely, but entirely possible that the human species could be effectively extinct in 100 years. It could happen that quick." If we think about things like methane, all this methane that's stored as methane hydrate. There are enormous concentrations of methane hydrate in the Arctic and under the Arctic oceans. And as the Earth warms, as the ice in the Arctic no longer forms or melts away in the summer, more and more of these methane hydrates are going to be released. And this is a real problem because methane is 23 times more potent per molecule than carbon dioxide on a 100-year time scale. And on a 20-year time scale, it's 105 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So all this permafrost up there is packed with this stuff. There's permafrost around the whole of the North Pole. We're talking Siberia, we're talking Alaska, northern Canada. Enormous amounts of how much? How much? Let me tell you how much. So much that 17 million tons of this are being released into the atmosphere each year. Now, in 2010, that was only 7 teragrams. Now we're up to 17 teragrams. And we're talking about stupid amounts of this gas. As the gas is released, the Earth gets hotter, more gas is released, the Earth gets hotter, more gas is released, the Earth gets hotter. And this could happen very, very quickly. A feedback loop, a climatic feedback loop. And maybe we could depopulate the Earth, quit having so many babies. Or maybe we could slow down some of the things that are contributing, but we're not doing it. So what are we looking at? We're looking at things like a 50 gigaton burp of methane from Arctic permafrost under the East Siberian Sea, which is, according to the EAS, highly possible at any time. Quoting from, what am I quoting from here? It's important to know these things. Quoting from Dar Jamal's The Methane Monster Roars from 13 January 2015 on Truth Out. Continuing the article, this means that methane release from decaying frozen hydrates could result in emission rates that could change an order of magnitude in a matter of minutes, and that there would be nothing smooth, gradual, or controlled about it. We could be looking at non-linear releases of methane in amounts that are difficult to fathom. So forget this 2 degrees centigrade stuff, as a kind of the top end of the rise. Think 6 to 10 degrees global climate increase immediately. And think of what that's going to do to the weather, to the droughts, to the storms. And methane pops out really quickly, a 50 gigaton burp just from the East Siberian Sea. That would be the equivalent of about 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And we've only released about 1,475 gigatons since 1850 in total carbon dioxide. So we could get that much, almost that much again, in a burp. Boom. Already, methane is measurably a larger part of our atmosphere. In the last 2 centuries, we've gone from 0.7 parts per million to 1.7 parts per million. That's more than a 100% increase. Oh, yes. And a lot of the smart money is saying that global temperature of 4 to 6 degrees centigrade is inevitable. And that's a real game changer. That's a great game changer. 2014 was the warmest year ever in the instrumental records. And we're still going around like nothing's happening. We have, not in our government, not in our corporations, not in our public vernacular, any idea of stewardship. Right? Where do we see it nationally? What we see are these divisions of partisan toxicity. And politicians spew these forth to get noticed and get airtime and get elected, but they destroy all civil discourse in the public sphere about stewardship. They pervert the language itself. You know, the Senator Inhoffs and Representative King of New York. I mean, these people actually pervert the language into the language of the propagandist and the language of the advertiser and the language of the huckster, the snake oil salesman. There are reasons for this. And one of them is the wealth controls what was once shared in trust. What was once shared in trust to our government. The airwaves, for example. But news, politics, decision-making, all of these things, we sort of trust. They were given to our government in trust. But now we find citizens are treated like petulant children. And not content with controlling news and politics and decision-making, not content with putting profit over even survival, they want to own even more. They're envious of the national parks and the money they could make. Greed steers them again. They lust for this stuff. The water, the air, the parks, the streams, the roads, they want to own it all. Things that were ours and still are, theoretically, that were made or preserved by citizenry and with the assistance of trusts in government. But where is the stewardship? Where is real stewardship? Nowhere. Certainly not in government. So our media don't dig into these crucial stories, except in a form that could, get people fired up about a candidate, but certainly not in a form that could mobilize people to action. Instead, it creates only fear, leading to acedia, leading to sloth, leading to despair. And we pretend we're not in despair, and we eat more, and we spend more, we buy more stuff to the extent we can, and we fail to see the suffering of the people around us. We fail to see the decline of the culture around us. I don't know about you, but they've been trying to frighten me for most of my life. First it was nuclear war, and then it was, the Bolsheviks and the communists, and then it was the communists in Vietnam, and now it's Al-Qaeda, and, nuclear war has kind of gone onto a background. After a while, you just you really need to just quit being afraid of this stuff and just let it go. Let it go. But all of it serves power. All of it serves particular kinds of power. As a reaction to all of these lies, these distortions of language, this lack of a genuine social fabric, we as a people have succumbed to the isms that they've sold us. Materialism, consumerism, nationalism, and individualism. And all of these are substituting for something else. Materialism is a substitute for having one's needs, having what you need. Consumerism is a way of feeding a hunger we can never quite get rid of. That to get rid of, we would have to be at peace with ourselves. And we can't do that. So like hungry ghosts of Buddhism, these large creatures with tiny little mouths, we consume incessantly. Nationalism takes the place of community, and individualism takes the place of a social world that makes sense. So these all take the place of elements of a shared framework of obligation to others, of care for others, of building a shared language of signs and symbols with others. And instead, we chase after materialism, consumerism, nationalism, individualism. Doing things with others towards communal goals creates meaning. That's the only thing that does. That's where we build these signs and symbols, and we test and we elaborate their meaning. Doing things with others toward communal goals. And if the current social world does not have this activity, if it doesn't encourage these, then we must make a new social order. We must build a new social order where we can create these meanings. The neocons and the neolibs, the militarists, the Bible-thumping TV ministers have all failed dismally. The capitalists have failed. The corporatists have failed. And the only reason we don't see it is because we measure their success by how much money they've accrued. Ooh, they must be doing it right. They got a lot of money, huh? But at the end of the day, they've proven Marx correct in his analyses that the dominant ideas of every age are those of the ruling class. What are the dominant ideas of our age? Wealth, greed, lust, kind of numbed stupor where we just don't care anymore. Having secured their power, the people in power, they've locked all of this in, and they really have a firm grasp on power and control. Nothing gets on the TV. Really, nothing rises to a national level. Nothing will be part of the national discussion and debate. So the only option that leaves is, as I said, to make a different world. And there was the most interesting piece floating around this last week. The most interesting piece on The Guardian by Paul Mason, talking about post-capitalism. Paul, I'll just read some excerpts. It's a rather long article, but I'll post it on the Facebook page. At the end of feudalism, 500 years ago, he writes, capitalism's replacement by post-capitalism will be accelerated by external shocks and shaped by the emergence of a new kind of human being. So, as with the end of feudalism, capitalism's replacement by post-capitalism will be accelerated by external shocks and shaped by the emergence of a new human being. And it has started. New forms of ownership, new forms of lending, new legal contracts. A whole business subculture has emerged over the last 10 years, which the media has dubbed the sharing economy. Now, how radical is that, the sharing economy? People actually doing economic activity, people creating economic activity built around concepts of communality. Buzzwords such as the commons and peer production are thrown around, he continues. But few have bothered to ask what this development means for capitalism itself. And that's very true. And he goes on into some lengths to discuss what this means for capitalism itself. But it's especially his conclusion that I want to raise here. Do read the article. It's well worth your time. He asks, is it utopian to believe we're on the verge of an evolution beyond capitalism? We live in a world in which gay men and women can marry, and in which contraception has, within the space of 50 years, made the average working-class woman freer than the craziest libertine of the Bloomsbury era. Why do we then find it so hard to imagine economic freedom? It is the elites cut off in their dark limo world whose project looks as forlorn as that of the millennial sects of the 19th century. The democracy of riot squads, corrupt politicians, magnate-controlled newspapers, and the surveillance state looks as phony and fragile as East Germany did 30 years ago. He continues, all readings of human history have to allow for the possibility of a negative outcome. It haunts us in the zombie movie, the disaster movie, and the post-apocalyptic wasteland films such as The Road or Elysium. But why should we not form a picture of the ideal life built out of abundant information, non-hierarchical work, and the dissociation of work from wages? That's such an important point. One could do a whole show on that. The dissociation of work from wages and the non-hierarchical work. Because we are such elitists about work, aren't we just? Continuing with the article by Paul Mason, millions of people are beginning to realize they've been sold a dream at odds with what reality can deliver. Their response is anger and retreat towards national forms of capitalism that can only tear the world apart. Watching these emerge from the pro-Grexit left factions in Syriza to the National Front and the isolationism of the American right has been like watching the nightmares we had during the Lehman Brothers crisis come true. we need more than just a bunch of utopian dreams and small-scale horizontal projects. We need a project based on reason, evidence, and testable design that cuts with the grain of history and is sustainable by the planet. And we need to get on with it. So, Paul Mason, post-capital. Think about that. And it's true, this all does look terribly fragile. I think it's another reason that people are holding on so tightly to wanting to believe that this is all going to work. Partly because, they can't imagine anything different, and they wouldn't know what to do without it, because take away our PlayStations and we are a third world nation. We are. Take away our gadgets and our cars and, our McMansions, and what are we? Are we good? Are we just? Do we have community? Do we respect other people? How do we comport ourselves in the world? This is where we have to go back to. I mean, if we're going to talk about being good, being decent, about actually having a society that works, that teaches rules to not only govern oneself, but also one's relationships with others, philos and law and ethics. If we're going to build a culture that can capture and formulate and metaphorize and preserve and transmit across time and across space these symbols and signs, rather than the babbling nonsense from a lost and deranged culture, as the man said, we need to be about it. We need to get on with it. And we can, and people are. But part of it, too, is realizing that those 7 deadly sins that we've raised to our national motto, sloth, pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, that these are traps for people, that these are traps for us, and that the first step that is required is ethics, reflecting on one's own actions, on one's own desires, on what one is doing, and then practicing different habits until they move beyond praxis and become hexes. They move beyond praxis and become hexes, what you are in the world. And then, when one spends time with such people, one can talk about real things. One can talk about real ideas. One can talk about real shared interests and how to achieve them. But it does take that first step by each of us. Reflection, thought, and change. We have to remember how to be charitable. And that concludes today's show. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today here on Long Waves Radio with Gary Krug. You can email me, longwaves, 2 words, at kyrs.org. Love hearing from people. You can find me on Facebook, Long Waves Radio, 3 words. And you can find podcasts of previous broadcasts on Facebook, Long Waves Radio. 3 words. Put it all in quotes. You'll turn it right over. And if you're a little bit clever with the Google machines, it won't be any difficulty at all. So I'd love to hear from you. Please write with ideas for shows. Please write with comments, criticisms, approval, disapproval. It's all grist for the mills around here. I'll be back next week with another show. Again, thank you for listening, and I'll remind you, you are listening to KYRS, Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. Have a wonderful week. I'll be back 7 days from now. Bye-bye.